Like I've been saying, the rules just seem to flip flop with whatever they're comfortable with, and overwhelmingly, it's primarily to get the people who are like, I'm not gonna take it to take it, and so they realize that these individuals are like, well, maybe I'll just wear a mask, right? If you tell me that masks work, well, then I'll wear a mask, and then they're like, oh shoot, all right, well, if you get it, well, then you don't have to wear a mask. And then they're like, well, I don't care. I want to wear a mask. And then they're like, well, then you can't go to the store. You got to keep a mask on. And then you got a bunch of people that are just like, okay, fine, I'll wear a mask. And then you get some people like me, like I've never worn a mask. I've never worn a mask in any of these places. Don't wear a mask outside. The only time I will wear it is if the business owner requires me to take it. But for the most part, I know that as a nurse, where there is free flowing air, you don't need to wear a mask. Your chances of getting sick are as close to zero as you're going to get for any respiratory disease. Now, of course, no one ever did this for the flu, and tens of thousands of people get hospitalized and many die as a result of the flu, and no one ever told you that you needed to wear a mask. I mean, in the hospital, yes, if you chose not to opt in for the vaccine, then during that period of time, you'd have to wear a mask so that others wouldn't get sick. And then guess what? You'd have the exact same people in the hospital who would take the flu shot, and guess what? They would still end up with the flu. And of course, when you actually look at the statistics, overwhelmingly between all age brackets, right? From the youngest to the oldest, it's no greater than 50%. But when you look at geriatric patients, typically it's anywhere between like 16 and maybe 25% of geriatric patients who take it end up not getting the flu. And overwhelmingly, you still see many cases of flu and people get sick. Some individuals who have comorbidities and are geriatric end up dying, and we have accepted that because that is the reality of life. But this doctor, unfortunately, seems to, I mean, I'm not sure where she got her degree, but it's obvious that what they're talking about is not scientific, and it's not even what we have used in terms of observable reality. We have never used this in any way, shape, or form. And like I said, it has absolutely nothing to do with the current situation, that there are other things at play. And so she goes on to say,
well, I liked that part of what she had to say because I do think that we need to send the very clear message that vaccination is your ticket back to pre-pandemic life. But frankly, I was shocked by this announcement. I think they went from one extreme to another. And the major step that's missing here is, how do we know that people are telling the truth? We talked in the last hour about the honor code. I mean, if you're going to the grocery store, maybe you're fully vaccinated, you take off your mask at the grocery store. But who's going to be checking to see if others are also vaccinated?
And that's basically the point. Who's going to be checking? Now, of course, we didn't do this with the flu. All those geriatric patients that would go to the supermarket during the flu season, no one was ever saying, hey, let me see your flu card, right? We completely accepted that. Now, people will say, well, you don't understand. It's completely different. There are more people that died of this disease than of the other disease. And I would say, yeah, but supposedly there was a vaccine for that one, and you still had tens of thousands of people that got sick and ended up in the hospital. And what we also never accounted for were for the people who were home, got sick, and never saw a physician, right? We never accounted for any of those people. We never wide tested for people throughout the whole flu season to see whether you tested positive for the flu. Like, there's people that have come to the hospital that tested positive for the common cold but have absolutely no symptoms. And PCRs are not designed for diagnostic testing. They are not utilized to swab someone and then say, yes, you got it. That's not the point of having a PCR test. The PCR is just in addition to, does the person have science? Have we ruled other things out? What maybe is going around during this type of the year that we can rule out? And which is why you have things like, for example, broad spectrum antibiotics, where the doctor's like, I don't know what the hell you have, but we're just gonna throw an antibiotic that just basically covers just about everything, and we hope that shit works, and then come back if it doesn't. Right? That's basically how a lot of medicine works. The doctor might give you like a 7-day or 5-day, or give you like a CPAC, right? Maybe you take something for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. We're going to give you a broad spectrum antibiotic. We think this is what it is, but just in case, we're going to cover you for everything. And that's the science. That's the real science, where you go to your regular doctor, and that's exactly what happens. Unless they can specifically narrow it down to what they believe. A PCR test does not do that. All a PCR test does, and of course PCR test can be easily manipulated by ratcheting up the CT by ratcheting up the threshold. The threshold is too high, you're going to end up with a bunch of people with false positives. And of course, later on, like I showed yesterday in my yesterday's video, was even the CDC started to acknowledge, okay, if you've had the vax, well then even if you test positive, we're not going to count you. So even if you took the vax and you tested positive, but if you didn't go to the hospital or you did not die, then we're not going to count you in any of the numbers. And I'm like, well, why did you do that shit last year, right? Why didn't you do that for all those people who never made it into the hospital? Instead of every single day, it was, look at the numbers. These are the numbers, 50,000 tested positive, 100,000 tested positive, right? But they weren't asking you whether any of these individuals made it into the hospital until now, right? But that's always been the case. It's always been the case. It doesn't matter, and I've said this in numerous videos, but it doesn't matter if a person tests positive if they never make it into the hospital system, right? For example, like we just seen, right, New York Yankees, all of these people that tested they've been vaxxed for a while, they've tested them every single day, probably multiple times a day, and yet even then 8 of these individuals tested positive. And of course now the narrative within the mainstream media is like, well, none of them made it into the hospital, then they're not sick. It doesn't really matter. And it's like, no shit, why didn't you say that last year? And so the same principle should hold true, that if you're doing it now, then why didn't you do it then? If you tested positive then, they automatically lumped you up. Your number was flashed across the screen, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, whatever it was for the day. The purpose of that, of course, is to strike fear in your heart. That's the whole point. That was the whole point of constantly throwing those numbers out. Oh, this person tested positive, this person tested positive. But did they go to the hospital? No, they didn't. So what does it matter, right? That's what they want you to believe now. Now, because the vaccine is out, because this is the goal, is to get people to move in this direction, right? Very much like what I reported on last time with the gas pipeline being shut down, right? So the purpose, in my humble opinion, it's just a litmus test, right? Let's test the waters. Are these people still easily manipulated? Because it was just like 5 days later, they were like, oh yeah, we got it back up and running. And there was like no more information that came out. Who was it? Were they able to track down these people? Why was it that they were able to hack the system so easily? What are they doing moving forward? It was like none of that information is just like, none of that information is available. Kind of like that explosion that happened, what was it, in Louisiana? And it was like the same day they like open and shut case next. It was just, no one ever talked about it again. It was just like, we're just going to ignore that whole situation, right? A huge explosion that took place. Nothing happened. Was in the media for one day. And they were just like, oh, somebody's propane tank exploded. You get like some ridiculous nonsense about that. And people just take it and keep on moving. This is the purpose. This is to strike fear in the hearts of individuals. That's the purpose, right? Same thing with the gas. They get you people all riled up. Oh, everybody runs out there, creates a panic. Get your gas, get your gas, get your gas. And then there's no gas, and then they mix it onto like, oh my God, there's no gas. And then people are like, you see, I told you, there's inflation. I told you there's inflation. Look, now the gas goes up. The wood has been going up, and it's all related to supply shortages that you create. It's all related to supply shortages that you create. One guy's at the supermarket buying a whole bunch of chicken. You're like, why the hell are you buying chicken? Oh yeah, I heard there's going to be a chicken shortage. And then you go out and you buy it. You go out and run and you buy 5 chickens that you're going to be holding on to for the next couple of months. And then the next person does it, and the next, and the next, and the next. Same thing with toilet paper, right? Whole bunch of people staying home because the government shut down all the businesses. And so there's a bunch of men at home, and the wife is like, hey, why don't you work on the deck? And like, all right, everybody goes out and buys wood, and then wood prices go up. Everybody's getting stimmy money, so that it ain't my money, I don't care, right? So then so what happens is simple supply and demand. A bunch of people don't go to work. A bunch of restaurants close. Overwhelmingly, the restaurant industry is responsible for a lot of the food production that typically comes into major cities. And so what you see is as all these restaurants start to drop because they can't afford to stay open, because some people don't want to come to work because they're afraid. Some people are getting unemployment. Some restaurants were forced to close, and then some were only allowed to do takeout. And if your restaurant failed, then maybe instead of 3 restaurants in your neighborhood, maybe there was only 1. And now they were responsible for all of the supply. They were responsible for all of the supply, right? And so, but the demand remained the same, right? It wasn't like all the people just left the neighborhood. The demand remained the same. But now the person who's responsible for the supply, that 1 restaurant or those 2 restaurants or those 3 restaurants, are the only ones that are left. So what happens is, as you know, as the supply starts to drop because the restaurants can only create so much food, the demand remains the same. So what happens? Right? Prices go up. That's just the natural way that things work. Supply and demand. It has nothing to do with the creation of all the currency that they've made. Most of that is still stuck in the banking system. This is most people don't realize. They're like, oh, they printed all this money and everything's going to go to the moon. But that's what they want you to believe. They're trying to create the demand. They're trying to create inflation by fear. And that's why I made that last video talking about fear. When the lion sees a target, he hones in on it. And it's the utilization of fear to drive markets, right? If that was the case, then why isn't gold going up, right? I mean, you look at gold, gold ain't budging. Gold per ounce, gold actually went down when they were printing all that money, and gold dipped 20%, right? So why would that happen? People were really worried about the monetary system and US, they're gonna lose their status. But people would be running to gold like they did in Lebanon. Right? They were selling everything. They were selling their cars, the shirt off their back, the clothing that they had. They were like, I don't want, take all my shit, just give me the damn gold so I can buy food, because they realized the currency was useless. And if that was the case, you'd see the exact same thing here. Where's a lot of the money stuck? Market and Bitcoin, right? That's why I beat Bitcoin, because they had all this excess liquidity. So what did they do? They shoved it into different areas. Some of it went into housing, right? Because of the moratoriums. Why was housing going up so crazy? Moratoriums. No supply. People can't evict people. People were not paying, they were not paying their rent. And so that forced owners to pay their mortgages. And so individuals stopped paying their rent. It was like 25% of the country just said, fuck it, I ain't going to pay rent now, because the government said you can't evict, right? So now you had all these people with excess money. So what did they do with their money? They spent it. Thinking it was a fucking party, right? It's a party, baby. It's a fiesta. And they just started spending that shit. Where did it go? It went all into consumer goods. And then now that they just announced, they were like, oh, why are consumer consumption going down? It's because people realize, shit, I got to pay all this money back. What's going to happen? I'm getting evicted. Where am I going to go? Now you're going to see more houses go on the market. And people are like, it's all going to crash. And it's like, but there were no houses out there. And the government was giving out free loans. We're giving out loans. And of course, you had to have enough credit to be able to qualify for these loans. Same thing with the PPP loans. And it's like, people just don't understand the games that the people are playing. And it's overwhelmingly all fear-driven. It's overwhelmingly all fear-driven. Fear of the virus, fear that there's not going to be enough chicken, fear that there's not going to be, any toilet paper. It's all fear-driven. And that's how y'all people keep falling for the okie doke.